The notification lit up his phone at exactly 2:17 a.m. Max wouldn't have even seen it if he hadn't been working late on the Morrison project, the same one that had kept him at the office until midnight for the past 3 weeks. The message was from his bank, unusual activity detected on joint account. That's when his world began to unravel. 7 years of marriage, 12 years of his life dedicated to climbing the corporate ladder at Reynolds and Associates, and it all came down to a string of banking alerts that told a story he never wanted to read. Hotel charges. Expensive restaurants. Jewelry stores. All while he had been pulling overtime to afford their dream house in the suburbs. But it wasn't the money that made his hands shake as he dug deeper. It was the names. The locations. The dates. Each transaction was a puzzle piece that painted a picture of betrayal so complete it took his breath away. The Landmark Hotel, 3 blocks from his office. Giorgio's, his CEO Richard Sterling's favorite restaurant. Tiffany and Company, on their wedding anniversary, no less. Emily, his wife, had always been ambitious. That's what had drawn him to her in the first place, her fierce determination, her unwillingness to settle for less than what she wanted. He had admired that about her, even when it meant stretching their budget for designer clothes or taking luxury vacations they could barely afford. Investment in our future, she called it. He never imagined she'd invest in a future that didn't include him. The confrontation, when it came, wasn't the explosive scene he had imagined during those sleepless nights after discovering the truth. Emily was calm, almost relieved, as she confirmed what he already knew. Yes, she had been seeing Richard. Yes, it had been going on for months. And yes, she had already filed for divorce. "You have to understand, Max," she said, perfectly manicured nails wrapped around a wine glass that cost more than his first car. "Richard can give me the life I deserve. The life you promised but never delivered." He sat there, in the kitchen they had remodeled together just last year, and listened as she outlined how things would proceed. She wanted half of everything, the house, the savings, even his 401k. Her lawyer had already drawn up the papers. Richard's influence meant she'd probably get it all. "Don't make this difficult," she advised, her tone patronizing. "You're a smart guy, Max. You know you can't win against Richard's legal team. Just sign the papers, move on, and maybe, if you're lucky, you can keep your job." That's when something inside Max shifted. The crushing pain of betrayal crystallized into something harder, colder, more focused. Emily mistook his silence for defeat. She didn't notice the slight curve of his lips, the calculating look that replaced the hurt in his eyes. "I'll think about it," was all he said. That night, after Emily left to stay at her sister's, or more likely, at Richard's penthouse, Max began to plan. The corporate laptop he'd been issued as department head still had access to all of the company's financial records. Funny how no one had thought to revoke his privileges yet. Perhaps they thought he was too broken to be a threat. For the next 2 weeks, Max lived a double life. At work, he played the part of the devastated husband, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast. His colleagues avoided him, embarrassed by the gossip swirling through the office. No one noticed that he was staying later than usual, methodically combing through years of financial records, following the trail of Richard's indiscretions. It was amazing what people would overlook when they thought they were untouchable. The shell companies. The inflated contracts. The kickbacks carefully disguised as consulting fees. Richard had been clever, but not clever enough. He had never expected anyone to look too closely, after all, who would dare challenge the CEO of Reynolds and Associates. Max compiled everything meticulously, building an ironclad case. He made copies, encrypted them, stored them in multiple locations. Then, using an anonymous email account, he sent the evidence to 3 parties, the SEC, the board of directors, and, most devastatingly, to Andrea Chen, a hungry young investigative reporter who had been trying to crack open corporate corruption stories for years. The aftermath was spectacular. The story broke on a Monday morning, splashed across the financial pages and picked up by every major news outlet. By Wednesday, Richard was suspended pending investigation. By Friday, federal agents were walking through the offices of Reynolds and Associates, boxes of documents in hand. Emily's calls started the following week. First angry, then panicked, finally desperate. The prenuptial agreement Richard had promised to sign was suddenly off the table. His assets were frozen. The penthouse she had been living in was being seized as evidence. Her dream life was crumbling, and she needed somewhere to go. Max let the calls go to voicemail. Instead, he focused on rebuilding. He had seen the writing on the wall and secured a new position at a competing firm weeks before the scandal broke. His reputation as a whistleblower, far from damaging his prospects, made him attractive to companies looking to demonstrate their commitment to ethical business practices. He bought a modest but beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood, paid for with the whistleblower reward money he received from the SEC. He joined a gym, reconnected with old friends, started living the life he had put on hold while trying to fulfill Emily's endless demands. That's where he met Sarah, a pediatric nurse who loved weekend hiking trips and actually laughed at his terrible puns. She didn't care about designer labels or social climbing. She cared about making a difference in people's lives, about building something real and lasting. It was 6 months before Emily finally tracked him down. She was thinner, the designer clothes replaced by off-the-rack business casual. The perfectly maintained highlights in her hair had grown out, showing inches of natural brown at the roots. "You did this," she said, standing on his front porch. "You destroyed everything." "No, Emily," Max replied calmly. "You and Richard did this. I just made sure everyone knew the truth." "I made a mistake," she whispered, tears welling up in her expertly mascaraed eyes. "I know that now. We could try again. I still love you, Max. I never stopped loving you." That's when Sarah came to the door, wrapped in one of Max's old college sweatshirts, carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Hon. Everything okay out here?" The look on Emily's face was everything Max had imagined during those dark nights when revenge was all that kept him going. But now, standing there with Sarah beside him, he realized something surprising: he didn't need Emily's pain anymore. He was happy, truly happy, for the first time in years. "Goodbye, Emily," he said, taking the coffee from Sarah and closing the door. Through the window, he watched his ex-wife walk away, her shoulders shaking with sobs that no longer moved him. The woman who had once been the center of his world was now just another person who had underestimated him. Her mistake hadn't been leaving him, it had been assuming he wouldn't fight back. Sarah's hand slipped into his, warm and reassuring. "You okay?" Max smiled, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. The betrayal that had broken him, the revenge that had consumed him, and finally, the peace he had found on the other side. "Yeah," he said, squeezing her hand. "I really am." The next day, a thick envelope arrived from his lawyer. The divorce was final. Emily had signed away all claims to his property, his savings, everything. In the margin of the last page, in handwriting he had once loved, was a single line: "You win." Max took the papers and filed them away in his office. He didn't need to win anymore. He had something better, he had his life back, and this time, he was living it on his own terms. That evening, as he and Sarah walked their dog through the neighborhood, greeting neighbors and planning their weekend, Max thought about how differently things had turned out from what he had imagined. He had wanted revenge, had achieved it spectacularly, but in the end, the best revenge hadn't been the carefully orchestrated downfall of Richard and Emily. It had been finding happiness despite them, because of them, and ultimately, without them. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Sarah was talking about her day at the hospital, about a young patient who had finally been declared cancer-free. Her face glowed with genuine joy at being able to share good news with a family who had been through so much. Max listened, feeling the last traces of bitterness fade away. He had learned something valuable from all of this: sometimes losing everything you thought you wanted was the only way to find what you really needed. As they turned toward home, Sarah's hand still in his, Max realized that he had one last thing to thank Emily for, though he never would. Her betrayal had freed him. Not just from a marriage built on false promises and endless demands, but from his own misconceptions about what made a life worth living. The story that had begun with a late-night banking alert had ended up somewhere he never expected, in a place of contentment, of genuine connection, of peace. The revenge that had once seemed so important was now just a chapter in a much larger story, one that was still being written, one day at a time, with someone who shared his values, his dreams, and his understanding of what real love looked like. They reached their front porch just as the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. Sarah leaned against him, comfortable in the silence they could share without trying to fill it with meaningless chatter or demands for attention. "What are you thinking about?" she asked finally. Max looked at their home, modest by Emily's standards but perfect for them, and smiled. "Just thinking about how sometimes you have to lose your way to find where you're supposed to be." Sarah nodded, understanding without needing a detailed explanation. That was another thing he had learned to appreciate, the ability to be understood without having to justify every thought and feeling. As they went inside, Max glanced one last time at the quiet street where he had rebuilt his life. Somewhere across town, Emily was probably still plotting her next move, still searching for the lifestyle she thought she deserved. But that was no longer his concern. He had written his own ending to their story, and it was better than any revenge he could have planned. He was happy, truly happy, and that was something Emily had never managed to take from him, even though she had tried. The door closed behind them, and Max left the past where it belonged. He had a future to look forward to, and this time, he was writing the story on his own terms. Looking back, Max could pinpoint the exact moment his investigation into Richard's dealings had turned from desperate revenge into something more meaningful. It was during one of those endless nights at the office, as he pieced together the evidence of corruption, that he'd stumbled across something unexpected: dozens of similar victims of Richard's schemes. There were small business owners who had been forced into bankruptcy after Richard's company deliberately delayed payments on contracts. Elderly investors who had lost their retirement savings to carefully orchestrated pump-and-dump schemes. Junior employees who had been sexually harassed and then silenced with settlements and NDAs. That's when Max's mission had evolved. It wasn't just about getting back at Emily and Richard anymore, it was about justice for everyone they had hurt in their climb to the top. He had spent weeks reaching out to other victims, gathering statements, building a network of witnesses willing to testify once the story broke. The SEC investigation had only scratched the surface. In the months that followed the initial arrests, more victims came forward. Class action lawsuits were filed. Richard's carefully constructed empire of lies began to crumble, brick by brick, revealing the rot at its foundation. Emily, as it turned out, had been just another player in Richard's grand scheme. She wasn't the first married woman he had seduced with promises of wealth and status, nor was she the last to be discarded when things got tough. Max had found evidence of at least 3 other affairs with employees' wives, each following the same pattern: lavish gifts, promises of a better life, then abandonment when the women were no longer useful to his ambitions. Sarah had been the one to help Max see this larger picture. As he shared more details of his story with her, she had asked questions that made him think beyond his own pain. What about the other families affected by this, she had wondered. What about all the people who lost their jobs when the company's stock crashed? Her compassion had helped transform Max's revenge into something more meaningful, a chance to make real change in corporate culture. He had started mentoring younger professionals, sharing his story as a warning about the importance of ethical business practices. He gave guest lectures at business schools about corporate whistleblowing and the responsibility of executives to maintain ethical standards. The irony wasn't lost on him that his act of revenge had ultimately led to him making a bigger positive impact than he ever had while trying to climb the corporate ladder. His new firm had promoted him to head of their ethics compliance division, a role that allowed him to put his hard-learned lessons to good use. Sarah's influence had extended beyond just helping him process his past. She had shown him what real partnership looked like. When he was preparing to testify at Richard's trial, she had spent countless hours helping him organize his thoughts and documentation. When he was nervous about giving his first guest lecture, she had sat in their living room for hours, playing the role of an attentive student while he practiced his presentation. Their relationship grew stronger through each challenge. Unlike his marriage to Emily, which had been built on constant striving for more, his connection with Sarah was grounded in mutual support and genuine care for each other's well-being. They celebrated each other's successes without competition, supported each other through difficulties without keeping score. 1 year to the day after Emily's last visit to their home, Max proposed to Sarah. There was no elaborate plan, no expensive ring, no grand gesture. They were simply sitting on their back porch after dinner, talking about their days, when Max realized he never wanted these simple moments to end. "Marry me?" he had asked, reaching for her hand across the table. Sarah's smile had been answer enough, but her words made it even better. "I thought you'd never ask." They planned a small wedding in Sarah's parents' backyard, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about them. Max's new colleagues mixed with Sarah's hospital friends, creating connections that went beyond superficial networking. There was laughter, genuine joy, and not a designer label in sight. The morning of the wedding, Max received an unexpected email. It was from Emily, sent from an account he didn't recognize. The message was simple: "I heard you're getting married. I hope you'll be happy. I mean that." Max showed the email to Sarah, who read it thoughtfully before asking, "Are you okay?" He considered the question carefully. There was no anger left, no desire for further revenge, not even any lingering hurt. "You know what? I actually am. And I hope she finds whatever she's looking for." The wedding was everything their first one hadn't been: authentic, joyful, free from pretense. When Max and Sarah exchanged vows, their promises weren't about status or success or giving each other the life they deserved. They were about partnership, support, and growing together through whatever life might bring. As they danced under strings of garden lights that evening, Max caught snippets of conversation from their guests. People weren't talking about their clothes or their registry or comparing the event to other weddings they'd attended. Instead, they were sharing stories about the couple, how they'd met, the ways they complemented each other, the positive changes they'd seen in both Max and Sarah since they'd been together. Later that night, as they swayed to the last song, Sarah whispered, "Thank you for fighting your way back to happiness. For becoming the person you are now." Max held her closer, thinking about the long journey that had brought him to this moment. "Thank you for showing me what real happiness looks like." The stars twinkled overhead, witnesses to a new beginning built on the ashes of betrayal. Max had learned that true love wasn't about grand gestures or material success, it was about finding someone who made you want to be a better person, who supported your growth without demanding you change who you are. He had also learned that sometimes the best revenge wasn't about destroying your enemies, it was about building something so beautiful that their attempts to hurt you became irrelevant. Emily and Richard had tried to break him, but instead, they had inadvertently set him free. Free to discover his own strength, his own worth, and ultimately, his own path to happiness. As the wedding celebration wound down and their guests began to leave, Max and Sarah stood in the warm summer evening, surrounded by the love of true friends and family. This, Max realized, was what he had been searching for all along: not revenge, not success, not status, but genuine connection and purpose. Their new life together was just beginning, and Max couldn't wait to discover where it would lead. He had learned to trust in the journey, even when the path wasn't clear. After all, sometimes the worst moments in life led to the best ones. You just had to be brave enough to keep moving forward, wise enough to learn from your pain, and open enough to recognize real love when it finally found you. The future was bright.